Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into chapter 7 of Why Machines Learn, the elegant math behind modern AI. It's called the Great Kernel Rope Trick. Our mission: to unpack the really clever math and tricks behind support vector machines, or SVMs. These were revolutionary for a while in machine learning. We'll cover the main ideas, finding the best way to split data, and this really neat shortcut for handling complex stuff without getting lost in high dimensions, all based on the chapter you sent us. Ready? Okay, so it starts back in 91. AT&T Bell Labs. Bernhard Boser is there, about to move to Berkeley, and he connects with Vladimir Vapnik. Vapnik's this brilliant Russian mathematician, just arrived, and he gives Boser an algorithm from his own work in the 60s to code up the task: finding an optimal separating hyperplane.
Right, and a separating hyperplane. Think of it like a boundary line, or a flat plane in 3D, or, a hyperplane in higher dimensions. Its job is just to split data points into two groups in whatever space you're looking at. Circles on one side, triangles on the other, based on labels you already have.
Yeah, we've sort of touched on this with things like the perceptron before.
Exactly. But the perceptron, while it could find a line if the data was linearly separable.
Like there was a problem, right?
Yeah, the problem is, if it is separable, there isn't just one line. There are, infinitely many lines or planes that could perfectly separate your training data points.
That's not ideal.
Not at all. The source gives this great picture. The perceptron finds a boundary, maybe one that just squeaks by the data points. You get a new point, maybe a triangle, looks like it belongs with the others, but it's close to that boundary. Bam! It's classified as a circle.
Ouch. And you could maybe eyeball a better line in 2D, just nudge it over here.
Sure, but you can't eyeball in 500 dimensions.
Right. So we needed something systematic, a way to find the best line, the one most likely to get new data right. That's what Vapnik's 60s algorithm was really aiming for.
And his approach, the intuition behind it, is pretty neat. It's about finding the hyperplane that makes the margins, the empty space on either side, as wide as possible. Imagine clearing this, no one's land pathway through the data. The widest possible path where no data points are allowed inside. The best hyperplane runs right down the middle of that path.
Okay, maximizing the margin. And that makes sense intuitively. Feels more stable, less likely to get tripped up by new points near the edge. But how do you actually find that specific line mathematically?
That gets us to this really key idea: support vectors. These are the data points that end up being closest to the final hyperplane. They sit right on the edge of that widest possible margin. The chapter shows them as the black dots of the figures. They're critical because they're the only points that actually define where that margin is. They support the hyperplane, hence the name.
So, hold on. If I've got, say, 1 million data points, but only maybe 50 are right up against that no one's land, only those 50 actually determine where the best boundary goes.
Exactly. And we'll see in a bit why that's such a huge deal computationally. So mathematically, the goal is to find the specifics of that hyperplane, its orientation, defined by a weight vector W, which is perpendicular to it, and its position, defined by a bias B. Let's say circles are labeled label 1, triangles are +1. You've got n data points, each is a vector di with its label y. Vapnik's problem boils down to this: minimize a function related to the weight vector, specifically minimize 1/2 times the squared length of W, so 12W2. Minimizing that length, W2, actually corresponds directly to maximizing the width of the margin. It's sort of the same thing mathematically.
Okay, minimize the vector length to maximize the margin.
You can't just make W as small as possible willy-nilly. You have to do it while satisfying a condition for every single data point. That condition is the margin rule. Y times W.xi plus B has to be greater than or equal to 1. It basically forces every point to be on the correct side of the hyperplane and outside that margin, outside the no one's land.
Ah, right. So minimize this one thing subject to all these other conditions, these constraints from the data points. That sounds like a classic
constraint optimization problem.
Exactly. We're not just finding the bottom of a bowl, we're finding the lowest point that also follows all these rules.
Precisely. And for that, we often turn to the work of Joseph Louis Lagrange, an 18th century mathematician. The source has this brilliant analogy, actually. Imagine you're a prospector on a hillside. You want to find the lowest point, minimize your altitude function, f, but you're constrained. You have to stay on a specific circular path, say g equals some constant, maybe marking a mineral vein.
Okay, so you need the lowest altitude, but only considering points on that circle.
Right. And Lagrange had this incredible insight about where the minimum or maximum must be on that constrained path. Think about the contour lines on the hillside lines of equal altitude. Think about your circular path. at the optimal point on the path. The tangent line to the altitude contour and the tangent line to the path itself must be parallel.
Oh.
And since gradients, the direction of steepest ascent, are perpendicular to tangents.
Ah. Then the gradients must point in the same direction.
Exactly. The gradient of the function you're minimizing, altitude, must be just a scalar multiple. Call it lambda, the Lagrange multiplier of the gradient of the constraint function, the path. So HM-BLH. That's the core idea. You can set this up using a Lagrangian function, L equals F minus lambda times G, set its gradient to 0, and you get back to this condition.
Okay, that's the general method. How does it help us with the SVM problem, with minimizing W2 subject to all those yai W.xi plus B equals 1 constraints?
Well, when you apply Lagrange's method here, and there's a bit more math involving multiple constraints and moving to what's called the dual problem, which turns out to be super useful, the amazing result you get is that the optimal weight vector W is actually a weighted combination of the training data vectors themselves. It's W all the REL data points, IEC. The IEC here are the Lagrange multipliers you solve for, one for each data point string.
Whoa, hang on. The vector W that defines the best boundary is just built out of the data points we started with. That seems profound somehow.
It really is. And it gets even better when you think about how you classify a new point, say U. The rule depends on the sign of W dot U plus B. But now we know W is that sum.
Ah, so you substitute the sum in for W.
Exactly. And when you do that, the decision rule ends up depending only on dot products between the new point U and the training point Z, as it becomes the sign of sum EE times the dot product AE plus the bias B.
Okay, dot products.
Now, here's the kicker. Remember those Lagrange multipliers, the AE. The optimization process sets I to 0 for any data point E that is not a support vector.
The ones that aren't right on the edge of the margin.
Precisely.
Yep.
So in that big sum E, all the terms where a Dewey isn't a support vector just vanish because their A is 0.
Oh. So going back to my example, the million points with only 50 support vectors, you only need to compute 50 dot products involving the new point U and those 50 support vectors.
That's it. Both finding W and classifying new points rely only on dot products involving the support vectors. It's massively efficient, especially if support vectors are a small fraction of your data.
Wow, okay, that's incredibly clever. So we have an optimal linear boundary finder, and it's efficient thanks to support vectors and dot products. Amazing. But what if the data just isn't linearly separable? Like circles inside a ring of triangles, no straight line is going to work there.
Right, that's the next hurdle.
Yeah.
And Vapnik's idea for this was also pretty ingenious. If you can't separate it here, maybe project the data into a higher dimensional space where it does become linearly separable.
Projecting up, how does that work?
Think of the sources example. 2D data by 1 and by 2, all mixed up. You can create a new 3D version by adding a feature, maybe something like by 1 squared plus by 2 squared. Now you plot your points in this new 3D space using by 1, by 2, by 12, plus by 22. Maybe now, in 3D, you can find a flat plane that separates the circles and triangles. Then, you find that plane in 3D and project its boundary back down onto your original 2D space. What was a flat plane in 3D might look like a nice circle or curve in 2D, perfectly separating your original data.
That is a neat trick, turning a curvy boundary problem into a flat plane problem in a higher dimension. But doing that projection explicitly sounds expensive. If I map 2D to, say, 1000D, calculating those dot products at side IU in 1,000 dimensions is going to take forever.
Exactly. That's problem number 1, computational cost.
And problem number 2, how do I even know what features to add? Like, by 12 plus by 22 worked in that example, but the source shows another one where that doesn't work. How do you find the magic projection?
You've nailed the challenges. Explicit projection is costly. And finding the right projection function, the right feature map, the phi, that takes ex officio is really hard. This is where Isabelle Guyon comes in. She was also at Bell Labs, knew Vapnik and Boser, and had a background in neural nets. The story goes she had this key insight talking to Boser one morning. She knew about a technique, a kind of mathematical shortcut, that could completely avoid having to do the explicit projection and the high-dimensional dot product.
A shortcut. Okay, I'm listening.
This is it. This is the kernel trick. It's incredibly elegant. Remember how Vapnik's optimal margin algorithm, after all the Lagrange stuff, ended up depending only on dot products between vectors, like late.xj or AIAEU?
Yeah, that was crucial.
Okay, so the kernel trick says, instead of taking your original low-D vectors I and xj, explicitly mapping them to high-D vectors I and xj, and then calculating their dot product, xj, way up there. What if you could find a special function, let's call it k, the kernel function, This function k takes the original low d vectors I-j as input, and it directly computes a value that is exactly equal to the dot product you would have gotten in the high-dimensional space.
Right.
So ksy, xj, but you calculate k just using the original x and xj.
Wait, what? You get the high-dimensional dot product result without ever going to the high dimension? That sounds like magic. Is that allowed?
It totally is. Let's use that simple example from the source again. 2D data by 1 by 2. The feature map to 3D was INX till H by 12 by 22 square T2 and 1 by 2. The 3D dot product, A, came out as A1 B12 plus A22 B22 plus 2 A1 A2 B1 B2. Now consider the kernel function KAB equals to this. That's just the regular 2D dot product A1 B1 plus A2 B2 squared. If you multiply that out, AB2 equals A1 B1 plus A2 B22 plus A2 B2 plus 2 A1 B1 and A2 B2.
Same thing.
Exactly. You computed KAB entirely in 2D, just AB2, and got the result of the 3D dot product B without ever calculating A or B.
That is a trick, a brilliant one.
It avoids all that computational cost of high D vectors. The source also shows the polynomial kernel, KXY, 1 plus XY2, which implicitly maps 2D to 6D. Again, the kernel calculation is way faster. And the general polynomial kernel, KXY, C plus XYD, lets you implicitly map to higher and higher dimensions just by increasing D.
So Guyon knew about this trick.
Yeah, apparently Iserman, Braverman, and Rosenor had used a similar idea for the perceptron way back in 1964. Guyon's breakthrough was realizing you could combine this kernel trick with Vapnik's optimal margin classifier.
Okay, why is that combination so important? Didn't a kernelized perceptron already give you nonlinear boundaries?
It did, yes. By finding a linear boundary in the kernel projected space. But remember the original perceptron issue. It finds a boundary, maybe not the best one. When you combine the optimal margin idea with the kernel trick, you get the support vector machine. The SVM finds the optimal nonlinear boundary in your original space because it's finding the optimal linear boundary, maximum margin, defined by support vectors, in that implicitly defined high-dimensional kernel space. The source has a figure showing this. The SVM boundary found using the margin principle often looks much more sensible and robust than what a simple kernelized perceptron might find.
Got it. Optimal margin plus kernel trick, SVM equals best nonlinear boundary.
And there are some really powerful kernels. The source talks about the RBF kernel radial basis function, KAB, exopanus gamma AB2. Calls it the Brad Pitt of kernels because it's so widely used and effective.
Brad Pitt, okay. What's so special about it?
The truly mind-blowing thing about the RBF kernel is that it corresponds to a dot product in an infinite dimensional space, a Hilbert space.
Infinite dimensions, seriously.
Seriously. Which means, in theory, using the RBF kernel allows the SVM to find a linear separation for any complex data distribution, because in infinite dimensions, you can always draw in the hyperplane. It allows SVMs to act as universal function approximators capable of learning incredibly complex decision boundaries.
Wow. Okay, my brain hurts a little, but in a good way. Infinite dimensions computed with a simple function. That's the rope trick. So following the history, Boser implemented this kernelized optimal margin classifier. Guyon wrote the paper for the CL292 conference.
Yeah.
And there's that funny story about it being seen as just an application paper, even though she thought it was super theoretical.
Yeah, perceptions can be funny. Then a few years later, 1995, Cortez and Vapnik introduced the soft margin classifier, the support vector network. That was key for real-world data, which is often messy. It allows some points to be inside the margin or even on the wrong side, but you pay a penalty for it. Makes it more robust to outliers.
And the name support vector machine, SVM, came from Bernhard Boser.
That's right. So putting it all together.
SVMs take messy, nonlinear data, implicitly project it way up high, maybe infinitely high, find the best separating hyperplane there using maximal margins and support vectors, but do all the math efficiently back down in the original space using a kernel function. Is that about right?
That's a perfect summary. And the impact was just huge. SVMs really took over machine learning in the 90s and early 2000s. Vapnik often got a lot of the initial credit, maybe because of his earlier VC dimension theory, but the source rightly points out the crucial roles of Guyon and Boser. They all shared that BBVA award in 2020, recognizing those joint contributions.
And you see why when you look at where SVMs were used. That BBVA citation list is amazing. Voice recognition, handwriting, faces, spotting cancer, genomics, neurology, credit card fraud, climate science, geophysics, astrophysics, even optimizing HIV drugs. Just incredible reach.
It really shows how powerful this mathematical framework turned out to be in practice. Of course, the source notes that deep learning and neural networks have become more dominant recently.
Yeah, the pendulum swings back.
But interestingly, it also mentions ongoing research, finding some deep theoretical connections between these modern neural nets and the older kernel machine ideas. So maybe the story isn't over.
That's a perfect lead-in, actually, because next time we're going to look at John Hopfield and his networks, part of that earlier neural net wave that influenced people like Guyon. So let's recap this deep dive. We went from the limits of simple lines to finding the best line with margins and support vectors, hit the wall of nonlinear data, and then saw the sheer elegance of the kernel trick, letting us work in these crazy high dimensions computationally.
Yeah, that kernel trick doing high D work implicitly with a low D function, that's the core magic, the aha moment that made SVMs practical.
And that combo, optimal margins plus kernels, gave us machines that could classify really complex stuff accurately across so many important fields for like 2 decades. We've hit the concepts, algorithms, examples, history, applications from the chapter, which leaves us with this final thought for you. Deep learning is king right now, sure. But with researchers finding links back to kernel ideas, how might these concepts of optimal margins, support vectors, implicit high-dimensional mappings through kernels, how might they influence what's next in AI? Could the Brad Pitt of kernels make a comeback? Maybe even inside deep learning itself. Lots to think about there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Chapter 7 of Why Machines Learn. We hope you appreciate the just the sheer elegance of the math here and how much it shaped the AI tools we rely on.